The next control flow structure we're going to look at is the for each loop. The for each loop allows us to loop through a collection, like a list or an array, without having to keep track of which item we're in the collection. Let's go back and look at an example from an array, and then we'll look at an example from a list also. So we have an array of numbers. We'll just set it up for 10. In fact, let's just go ahead and put some numbers in it. We don't need the specification of the number of items, but we'll leave it in there. It won't hurt anything. And then to do this with a regular for loop, we'd have to write for int I, or some loop control variable, equals 0. I less than numbers dot length plus plus I. Console write numbers sub I plus a space, so that we'll have an organized output. And then we run this program, and there's our 10. We can do the same thing with a for each loop without having to worry about a loop control variable. All we need is a variable that will be used to store an item pulled from the collection, such as the array. So we're going to write for each num in numbers, console write num plus, and we already have the console read key, so let's run this program, and we get the same thing again. Now let's go back and look at the structure of the for each loop very briefly here. Keyword is for each, followed by a data type and an object name in some collection. And that can be an array or a list, other types also. And then inside that will be the body or the set of statements. And close it off. So that's how for each loops work. Let's look at another example with a list this time. So we'll move down to the next line. We'll write list string names equals new list string, type in a few names. To write a for each loop to move through those, we'll write for each string name in names. We'll put these one on a line this time. Name. So let's run the program. And there's our example. The key to a for each loop working is the idea that internally the compiler keeps something called an iterator that knows to begin at the beginning of a collection and work its way through item by item until it gets to the last element. So rather than have to keep track of the count or the length or any of those things, the for each loop does all that internally using this idea of an iterator. So for situations where you don't know in advance how many items are in a collection, of course most of them have some sort of property to tell you, or more importantly, if you just want to do something to every item in the collection, regardless of how many items there are, then using a for each loop is easier than using a for loop. You're less prone to make mistakes, and it's just easier to work with in general. When you can use a for each loop, you should use one, as opposed to trying to loop through a collection with a for loop. So that's all for this brief introduction to for each loops. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some other uses of for each loops before we finish up this chapter.